Conversations on race and policing began in response to the police killing of George Floyd on May 25, 2020. In this partnership between CSU San Bernardino and the Brennan Center for Justice, we hope to engage in ongoing discussions related to the history and current context of race, policing, and criminal justice with guests from diverse academic fields and backgrounds.
And thanks to everybody for joining. Thanks especially to our guest, Mac Muir, author of Cop Cop, which we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. In this, the 145th installment of Conversations on Race and Policing. A little bit later, one of our co-hosts, Stan Futch, will be bringing us to order after opening remarks. But for now, Matt Patino and Mike German are going to give our land acknowledgement and introduce our guest.
Thank you, Jeremy. California State University San Bernardino acknowledges that the land on which our San Bernardino facility is sited is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mariam community, commonly referred to as the Serrano people, which in the contemporary era are represented by two federally recognized Indian tribes, the Uaviatam of San Manuel Nation and the Morongo Band of Mission Indians. Our histories and stories are intertwined in this space, and by sharing them in culturally appropriate ways, we honor and celebrate our Indigenous neighbors and partners. Since 1965, CSUSB's development has benefited and will continue to benefit from this land's location and resources, and we recognize this. Along with this land acknowledgement, this university affirms tribal sovereignty and our responsibility to work with these tribes to further mutual respect and gratitude for all those involved. And now I'll turn it over to Mike German.
Thanks, Matt. Mac Muir was raised in Oakland, California. From 2016 to 2022, he rose to become a supervising investigator at the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board. From 2023 to 2025, Mac served as executive director of Oakland's Community Police Review Agency. He is the author, along with Greg Finch, of Cop Cop, Breaking the Fixed System of American Policing. Mac, thanks for being here, and tell us about your book and fill us in more about what you're doing today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike. I really appreciate it. So Cop Cop, Breaking the Fixed System of American Policing is really the story of American policing through the lens of everyday people who sign up to investigate police misconduct. So in New York City, there's an agency of over 200 people who investigate complaints of NYPD misconduct. That's force, abuse of authority, which tends to be constitutional violations, discourtesies, offensive language, and false statements, in addition to sexual misconduct. So how all this started for me is I actually wrote what was functionally my thesis on the Oakland Police Department, the history of that police department, its relationship to the community, and different critiques of how the police department had been functioning. I ended up working as a staffer to then Governor John Hickenlooper out in Colorado, and over the course of that time developed a relationship with the head of corrections. And as we had conversations about how to make a meaningful impact on the American criminal justice system, he actually told me to come out to New York City and get involved with the Close Rikers campaign. So my original plan when I moved out to New York was to work on corrections reform, focus on closing Rikers, still in progress, as we all know. And when I showed up, actually, the job that I was moving for got defunded by the city council. And so I was sitting there in New York. I had reasons to stay. I really liked it here. And a friend of a friend said, hey, I know somebody who works at this agency that investigates police misconduct. As long as you're a good writer and you can give a good interview, you're going to get the job. So I signed up and I plan to stick around for maybe 2 months. I just said this will be a holdover as I find something else in the corrections universe. And what was striking is the moment that you got into the box of interviewing cops, interviewing victims of police misconduct, you knew you were bearing witness to something really extraordinary. And these were stories that were not being publicly told. At the time that I started and up until 2020, all of the records at our agency were withheld from public access. So the interviews, the closing reports, the disciplinary decisions, all secret except for very, very narrow circumstances. And so as that happened, saw sort of the boredom of of New York bureaucracy, right? The same way that aspects of policing can be very boring. But I happen to have a supervisor who really illuminated, I think, a beautiful way to see the work and really trying to understand um, not the truth of what happened, but the truth of perspective and be thoughtful as an investigator about how to approach that and thinking of these incidents really rather than just as incidents, as a series of movies. Movie from the perspective of the victim, of the witness, of the surveillance camera, of the officer, and then really step into the shoes of the people involved. And so, what we try to do in the book is illuminate those cases that have since become public record and walk through the process of actually investigating them. And in doing so, illuminate the uh, bad government that's at the basis of police accountability, not just in New York City, but across America. The failure for police departments to provide records, the failure to have adequate discipline for serious misconduct. And also, what I think drove me is as we hit the George Floyd moment, we had this, it was defund the police or back the blue. And I had just spent the last 4 or 5 years watching officers who seemed profoundly unhappy with the state of their employment, right? Like you would be sitting there and an officer cursed somebody, and there was just this like latent depression over the whole exercise, right? And as you know, there's different types of folks in law enforcement, and I was really getting a sense of the nuance of that conversation, and I was seeing an American conversation that was not appreciating the nuance of the factions within law enforcement and the challenges of that job, not in the, you could die any day sense, but as one author wrote, 50% of the job of what's emotionally draining about the job is the job itself, is the bureaucracy, is the leadership. And so as I'm sitting in front of folks who have lost loved ones and who are really struggling with that pain, or really struggling with the day-to-day humiliation, the stop and frisk that just happened because you could tell without anybody saying out loud. The officer had to hit a quota. Officer was getting pressure to get their stop reports up to an adequate level from their supervisor's perspective. Wanted to delve into that and actually got to go to CompStat and really delve into the datafication of policing, going back from the beginning of CompStat through the Bloomberg era, and how sort of as you've had this corporate leadership model in policing, you've had increasing data points that are driven from management that are unrelated to public safety. They're in relation to satisfying political needs. So we took those stories and really tried to illustrate, all right, there's some bad stuff that happens that we're all going to get some access to. We're all going to be familiar with the Eric Garner situation. And we follow that trial, which was prosecuted by our agency. I sat with the prosecution during that trial. But at the same time, seeing the little moments, the somebody just coming in, a young black man saying, "Hey, I just want to describe to you the stop and frisk, and what I'm feeling is I got sexually assaulted." And we, on as a data point, that's a stop and a frisk. And that person's not going to file a lawsuit. They might file a complaint that doesn't really go anywhere. But the aggregation of that is a serious risk to public health. And the illumination of the ways in which, as you get emotionally invested in the cases, you see, okay, so I got these perspectives. And then NYPD says we can't have the body cam, even though the agency is legally required to have the body cam. And the case misses a statute of limitations, so no officer is disciplined because of that. Or an officer tells their subordinates to turn off their body cams and not record, and there's no accountability that comes from that. All these compound for me to illuminate just a different perspective on American police. I mean, but one that speaks to what's most important to me right now. It speaks to the need for us on a local level across the country to address police accountability. And I would argue that the reason that we are having these failures at the federal level is because we have very low expectations for transparency and accountability in our own backyards. And so, what was wonderful for me as left the CCRB in New York, and I was raised in Oakland, and I got the opportunity to be the executive director of the Community Police Review Agency in Oakland. Much different model than in New York. In New York, you've got recommendations that go to the police commissioner and ultimately serious hassles with records and transparency. In Oakland, the police oversight entity has direct access to body cam. I was first on scene to police shootings, and I was the one walking through with the DA's office as they made a determination as to whether to prosecute an officer. And we were involved in the criminal investigations as well. So there would be concurrent administrative and criminal investigations, broad scope. There were protections for complainants. So officers faced termination if they were to interfere with the investigation or even contact the complainant in their own case. And we were an agency that had disciplinary power. And what I experienced was with a really level head and excellent investigations, we would sit down with the deputy chiefs in the department and the chief and make a presentation. Internal Affairs would make their presentation as well, and we would debate as to how to approach it, taking in any questions raised by the upper echelons of the police department, but ultimately saying, well, this is the discipline we got to have. And there was an appeals process for that, where the chief could go before my bosses and argue otherwise, and we had to make oral arguments in those hearings together. But what it meant was that everyone in the upper echelons of the Oakland Police Department had an understanding of how thorough our investigations were, where we were coming from, and we were having fact-based arguments about how to have an accountable police department where there was mutual respect. I mean, right, there are issues that come with just the understanding, right? I've never been in law enforcement. There are some things that I won't understand, and I'll concede that. But when we're talking about evidence, we can have a real conversation that isn't happening in a lot of cities because most of the time you're going to have an oversight entity send a report to the police leadership, and it may or may not have any impact because there's not a serious conversation, and then there's no stakes for ignoring it. So for me, I hope that this book gives folks a sense of the beauty of conducting investigations, the challenges that come with it, and even if it's not directly tied to police accountability, a better understanding of what evidence is, because we got the word investigation flying all over the place in the current political discourse. And I think that folks who are serious in law enforcement or investigations or wherever see that there's a big gap between our assessment of facts and how a Senate hearing is conducted, let alone an investigation into police misconduct. So that's my perspective. And right now, I've been working with an array of organizations on providing technical assistance around ordinances, local laws to strengthen police accountability and make sure that there are good checks and balances. And that's been the case from Honolulu to New York City, going around the country, talking about some of the points in the book. In particular, in Oakland, there is a plan for the oversight entity to actually take over all the responsibilities of internal affairs. And I think that's an interesting model that I'll be watching quite closely. But also saying, how can you just get better transparency? And it's all in the weeds, as we know, the little items in your local ordinance or your city charter are going to make a huge difference as to whether an officer faces appropriate action when something goes wrong.
Wow. Thank you, Mac. Interesting information. One of the things I had a question about is Oakland. What you're doing was amazing because most cities don't want that, period. And so, what brought on Oakland to do that? Were they corrupt, or what was going on?
Yeah, so in 2003, there was a federal lawsuit filed on behalf of 119 plaintiffs. And there was a group called the Riders. They were essentially a plainclothes unit in the Oakland Police Department that was accused in those 119 cases, and probably many more, of beating people up and planting drugs on them. So that unit faced criminal charges, all four officers. The sergeant in that unit fled the country, or fled the area, and allegedly the country the day before his trial began. He remains on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list. And since 2003, Oakland has been in what is now the longest federal consent decree in U.S. history. So that shaped, right, and you're talking about Oakland, California. Well, already you have the backdrop of whatever happened with the Black Panthers, and I argue still that's a conversation that hasn't happened in Oakland in a really transparent way with the police department. And I continued to argue that to the police department itself and to city officials. But then you have the federal consent decree, you have a judge. So it was not a DOJ consent decree. What happened is the city settled and a judge in, I believe, the Ninth Circuit was appointed the manager of this consent decree. There were, I believe, 54 points that the department had to complete in order to get out of that consent decree. They call it the negotiated settlement agreement. Over the course of that time, there were continued scandals. And I would argue for the first 9 years or so, a relative ambivalence by the police department to actually complete all the tasks in this settlement agreement. What at the same time, there were folks in the community, particularly folks who had lost loved ones at the hands of the police, who started to develop a new city charter and work with folks around the country to say, what is the most effective form of oversight we could have? And to my understanding, what they did is they wrote this and they didn't immediately introduce it to the city council. They said, all right, this is a department that's faced scandal after scandal. What we want to do is introduce this at a juncture where it's going to be most politically relevant and has the best chance to succeed, right? As you said, there's a lot of political pushback to meaningful charter reform. So they sat on it. And then in 2016, it was found that it was approximately 25 officers were sleeping with the same underage girl. And that sparked outrage in the community. And it coincided with an election year. Folks introduced that bill to create the Community Police Review Agency. And with that discipline authority, with the volunteer police commission having the ability to fire the chief of police with a lot of broad authority. And then that went through. And then over the course of the years since then, there's been refinements. But that ballot initiative passed, it was 83.9%, I believe. So that tells you how popular it was with the community. And, there are other cities that have created variations of this. Actually, Cleveland, in, I believe, 2021, created a much more robust oversight entity. Chicago has great access to records and a really great transparency. Actually, when there is a police shooting, the oversight entity releases the footage and runs the press conference. And so, and that's not the case in Oakland, but there are little snippets of really interesting practices that have come through these reforms, but it's usually tied to a thoughtful political timing.
Wow. What was there a mass exodus when that was implemented? Oh,
Yeah, I mean, if I remember right, they had 5 chiefs in like 10 days.
wow.
It might have been 4 in 10 days, but it was yeah, and it was too bad. I mean, on it's hard to say with the accountability that came there. There were major reforms, and of course, the federal judge, they were under federal oversight as this was happening. And what I found surprising, and I think was somewhat reflective of the unique aspects of the Oakland Police Department, is that this was almost all new officers. And it was a reflection of like failures of supervision in a way that oftentimes when you see scandals in police departments, there's a supervisor protecting younger folks or so on and so forth. Actually, how this first sparked was an officer killed himself and left a suicide note that laid out what was going on. And I think he had been cheating on his wife, is the aspersion there. But so it blew up, and it was yeah, a lot of officers living together. A weird situation, but what it did, it brought eyes on situation where internal affairs needed to be handled differently. And I say Oakland has a reputation as a department that has a lot of issues. And I don't think that's necessarily fair. I mean, I had access to almost all of internal affairs records, perhaps all of them, when I was there. And I think that one of the reason Oakland gets blasted for scandals is because it has federal oversight that forces it to be transparent. And I think in a lot of departments around the country, if you actually, opened up the files and had people talking about it, you would be the same thing. These things are going on. It's just harder to do that when you're under federal oversight, and the city doesn't have an option but to have to share with the judge what's going on. If that happened in Phoenix, I don't think that we would have ever heard about it, frankly.
Go ahead, Mike.
And I think that's true of most cities, right? I mean, and I'm particularly interested in your statement that it's important to gain local control over the police departments. And one of the things that we've seen through the lifetime of my career in law enforcement is the increased federalization of local police. You know,
Yeah.
through joint task forces where basically the federal government is co-opting state and local police to work on federal missions rather than the local missions, and you know, even allow them to work outside of their jurisdictions, and to operate under federal rules rather than state and local rules.
Yeah, it made for a real challenge. I remember I had a case up in Harlem where somebody said they'd been stopped and frisked, and I was like, I can't figure out who these officers are. They described them being NYPD, but that might have just been their perception of it or their expectation, right? And I went through this long investigation. I'm trying to figure out who these guys are, and then an attorney was like, "Hey, I'm not going to confirm this in any other setting, but those are feds, and maybe some of the cops with them were NYPD, but we can't really know that." And it's like, there's no tracking it. I think that's a big challenge. And in New York, you've got 30 to 40 different law enforcement agencies coming through at a given time, and little public awareness of what that is. So it becomes confusing. And then right now we're facing that head on with ICE, and I think I've struggled with the the conversation about ICE because my thing is like I want there to be internal accountability mechanisms, and the conversation is about like, are you going to enforce like sanctuary city policies? Um, but I think that's sort of irrelevant if, in New York, for example, if an officer were to coordinate with ICE, it's entirely at the police commissioner's jurisdiction as to whether to take any enforcement action. And you have an NYPD that is, at times functionally more powerful than the mayor's office. So if you don't have that internal accountability, if you don't have a requirement that an officer be disciplined for a specific act, it becomes sort of a moot point when you're talking about like this enforcement of policy where like I don't think the mayor's historically there have been instances, Rudy Giuliani was pretty hardcore. He would sometimes go to the police commissioner and say, hey, this person has to be fired. But also the more progressive you are, the more of a headache that conversation comes to be. Uh,
Yeah. And Jeremy and Matt, I see your hands up, but let me just follow up on that because we saw that in Los Angeles when the ICE buildup and the crackdown in Los Angeles. We saw LAPD and LA Sheriff's Office come out and violently subdue the protesters that were protesting the ICE actions. And when the LAPD chief was called before the city council to discuss whether they were assisting ICE, he made a comment that sort of, I think, framed it for me, where he said, hey, when our fellow law enforcement agencies seek our assistance, our obligation is to help them, rather than recognizing that no, you're the Los Angeles Police Department. Your obligation is to protect and serve the public, not to protect federal law enforcement when it's acting outside of its authority.
Yeah, and I thought it was tough that LA was the test case because frankly, from a public perspective, I think LA is the hardest police department system to wrap your head around. You've got approximately 45 police departments in LA County. You've got a sheriff department, and that means something different to folks in different states, right? If you told me the sheriff's department was here in New York City, I'd be like, I wouldn't exactly know what their enforcement purpose was, where they're the corrections officers functionally. And they've got the county patrol. It's a unique beast, which made taking accountability for coordination with ICE extra challenging, as that was sort of the one that exploded in the national scene. A
Yeah,
little clearer in Minneapolis.
yeah. Jeremy.
We have your books that just came in this week, and I want to encourage everybody. I just put the link there in the chat. I want to encourage everybody to get a copy of Mac's books because it's excellent. I'm lucky I got the shipment in first, and so I've been reading it, and so because of that, for this reason, I want to bring up a rather curious, perhaps curious, but a rather interesting incident of an ICE officer in New York City,
Yeah.
with one perhaps surprising, perhaps not surprising, but I think for a lot of people who have seen the optics of Immigration Customs Enforcement over the past few months, something rather unusual transpired here. I want to turn it over to you to tell us a little bit about that, Mac, and what sets this case apart.
Yeah, it was a really unique case that you had an ICE agent who was a young black guy who had a vehicle with tinted windows and ICE flak jackets on the back, and he gets pulled over by NYPD and accused of impersonating an ICE agent. And they actually didn't have a system to verify his identity. So he came down to us and was like, "Hey, well, as opposed to because some folks don't necessarily know why they're filing a complaint unless it's paired with a civil lawsuit and it's on legal advice." So he comes down and he's very straightforward. He's got a book, he's got the rules. He's like, "I'm filing a complaint and we're going to create a policy in the NYPD to verify the identity of a federal agent." And uh, the arc of the case is fascinating because he comes through, he's got wonderful notes, great documentation, and it is a pretty scary incident. He's held at gunpoint. Um, and he's like, "All right, I've got a meeting scheduled with NYPD leadership. We're going to do this. This is important to me." He was like, "You guys want to join ICE?" I'm like, "No, thanks." And fantastic color in that conversation. And then about two months later, if I remember right, he comes back and I see him in the lobby, and it's like, what's he doing back here? And then he was stopped again and had a gun held to his head. Very scary circumstances, and had been sort of blown off by NYPD leadership in his attempt to do that. So the arc and it really reaches its crescendo as at that second incident, as we're watching the body cam footage, a supervisor pulls him aside, and who's a older black officer, and he's like, "One of these white guys is going to kill you, man. You got to figure out a different way to handle your business." And for me, it just spoke to a fundamental challenge in law enforcement. And I think that it would have been a much different arc if the NYPD even responded to that by saying, "All right, we got to figure out a way to verify the identity of a federal agent." But then he walked away feeling as though the response from the NYPD had been, we'll decide whether you look like law enforcement. And as a young black man, you're kind of not going to fit the bill, and you shouldn't tint your windows, bro. So an interesting arc, especially in light of our current ICE environment. And I think that it does speak to as much for me, it speaks to some of it's a tipping point of the factions in law enforcement. And it's not just race, but it's folks who begin to appreciate that this is not a system that's designed to be particularly fair. And it's not responsive to blatant moments of unfairness or injustice. And my argument is that independent oversight is much more so, and it's much less responsive to political conditions because as we delve into this, when folks in society look at American policing and they say there are problems, my experience is that's usually reflective of political leadership. And the politician who appoints the police chief of police, whether or not they're doing it intentionally, is often asking for the results that they're receiving. And whether or not they're saying that out loud, if you say, "I need crime to be down," or "if I need more stops," or "I need more arrests," there's going to be less constitutional behavior if the goal is not public health. If the goal is, "I need numbers to be able to show the press," you're going to have screwed up conditions for the people in the communities that are most over-policed, particularly Black and brown communities, and for the officers who very quickly realize they're running against a brick wall and they're going to keep going into it until they can hit 20 years and get out of there. Or you get increasingly jaded, filled with enemy, as we call it, and then figure out other ways to cope.
Thanks, Mac. And just another thing I was struck by there was, again, in light of the optics of the ICE agents we've been seeing lately, was the remarkable, really hyper competence and calm demeanor of this ICE agent. I think it was really striking as I read this account of reading this about this very competent, very cool-headed, very capable of de-escalation ICE agent. So it really stood out in the book. I thought that was a cool, really great insight and example to share. And I'll toss to Matt.
Mac, before we came on live, you had mentioned, looking at policing, that there are the abolitionists and the reformers. And so I wonder if you maybe, because one of the arguments has been maybe there should be federal rules, this big blanket to cover everything. And then the argument back is, well, you don't understand what's supposed to happen locally. Since you've been in New York, and NYPD has to deal with five different boroughs, which is five distinctly different personalities, and versus California, where our policing is different, training is different, things like that. Could you kind of explain why maybe federalization is not necessarily the answer? That maybe there isn't a one size fits all to all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be fundamentally way more difficult to have accountability for federal law enforcement. It'd be much more subject to political pressures. And Mike, your book touches on some of the issues that would arise. But it's been Bill Bratton who's pushed for that most, that I've seen. And right, and Bill Bratton isn't pitching a new federal law enforcement. He's pitching the NYPD going national. When I see that, right, or meld the LAPD and the NYPD, like those aren't examples of departments that are behaving constitutionally. And that's my frustration. You look at the Federal Monitor's report here in New York, um, a significant percentage of stops and frisks are unconstitutional, bad arrests, and right, that degrades our faith in democracy. If that's federalized, I see serious consequences. Like I've talked to so many people who have had these what we see as like minor interactions with the police, and it just degrades their confidence in everything government. And so delving into the specific reasons that you shouldn't federalize. There's challenges with accountability. I also personally think, and there's a study that talks about the standardization of patrol guides for police departments. And my belief is that one of the things that makes America amazing is that you have these unique cultures that live in America. You go down to New Orleans, you can drink outside. You go down to Georgia, it's a different environment. You go to Denver, and so on. And the standardization of policing rules, in that if we're all going to just abide by sort of minimum standards from a federal perspective, takes away from some of what's unique about America. And I do think that there should be local rules that reflect what I'll call like community values, but the cultural values of those places. And sometimes that becomes a problem, right? You see folks go from one city to another and they get arrested because they're doing the thing that they thought they could do in New Orleans, in Nashville or whatever. But I think that is critical to us having a society with like diverse perspectives on how human beings can behave. And on top of that, and this is by no means my area of expertise, but I think that federalizing law enforcement would have severe consequences for surveillance. And I think that the regulation of surveillance, right? Right now you're working from department to department. You have cities banning certain types of surveillance, banning like AI arrest reports and so on. If you needed Congress to go to ban AI arrest reports, it's just not happening, right? Like to actually have even a responsive police department, you need to change the rules to adapt to Supreme Court rulings, to adapt to political conditions in ways that the federal government is and Congress are not prepared to do.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the political pressures that are put on different police departments. One of the things that we've heard frequently from previous guests have to do with funding. You're going to get more money if there are more arrests because you're making things safer, or you're going to get more money because crime is up and we need to make things safer. Can you kind of talk about the politics of it?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways that manifests, and I think that's one of the challenges. Um, Even from an accountability perspective, like one of my favorite books, it's Law Enforcement, Policing in the Future, Police Unions in the Future. I believe it's Ron DeLorde, and he wrote a sort of a manual for how to do police union communications. Um, and the strategies are really they go as far as human beings go to convince folks that you need more police or better conditions. I would say even for he's viewing it pretty strictly from just a union perspective. So better conditions for police officers, which is more pay and sometimes more officers because you want less less stress on the officers. Um, so that can come in the form of, yeah, crime numbers is going to be your first hit. So any mayor, city administrator, city manager needs crime to be going down in order for their career to be perceived as successful. I think my experience, and I'd be interested if you got a different take, is that if you've worked in law enforcement, you see that the way that crime numbers are gathered is subject to rampant manipulation, and you could move any stat up, maybe outside of homicides, maybe up or down 10% with like just collective negligence or collective movement in one direction or another. And so we delve into some of the complaints about NYPD crime management. And it's the story of the great crime decline, and also how that coincides with the datafication of policing that means some of these statistics are totally empty. For example, I was talking to let's say an insider in the police department who was he was telling me that he used to sit with a group of officers during the height of stop and frisk, and they talk about how 8 out of 10 of their stop reports were made up people, and that they were but they needed the numbers. So, and there were the dudes in the neighborhood who they'd stop 10 times and were like, I'm going to beat your ass if you stop me again. And then it's like, all right, well, I'm going to do that. And then at the same time, you have these inflated stats. So that's one aspect of it. And that comes from political pressure from Mayor Bloomberg to say, stop more people, get the guns off the street. So that's a key point. And then the management of crime statistics, as CompStat and variations of it have spread around the country, really is how a politician is able to tell the public, hey, well, I'm good. I'm whether I'm tough on crime, I'm good on public safety if the crime numbers are down. Um, so that's at the heart of it. And then from the police department's perspective, right, as a police leader, and I've seen this from the executive side, you're getting all this pressure from the union internally that never really faces the public, uh, going like, hey, if you want to stay here as police chief, we got to get some stuff here. And how hardcore that conversation is going to depend on the personalities involved. But there is immense internal pressure on police leaders, and those police union leaders can go back to the mayor, they can go back to folks in city government. And so it becomes this really complex push where, unless what that the counterbalance is just the community's desire for its resources to be spent effectively. But then when you have a public hearing where the police department comes forward with all these pressures saying, hey, we got to spend more on X, Y, and Z, and say, yeah, we need more money for overtime and we need $1 million drone. And without these things, you're in danger. It's kind of hard to compete with. And it's my challenge is that I don't find it to be a credible message most of the time. And it's hard to tell whether it's a credible message. Like my starting point is like I want to see what the officers are concretely doing. You got a crazy overtime bill. Let's talk about what the officers are spending their time doing, right? Internally, in Oakland, it's a city facing the edge of bankruptcy, and you see skyrocketing overtime. Officer making, I think it was $700,000-800,000 last year, and you're like, all right, well, can we have a fact-based conversation, not about like you're in danger if this doesn't happen. And that's the most compelling marketing scheme in America, I think, is that something bad's going to happen to you if X doesn't happen, and it's all too complicated for you to understand. So, I mean, that's my overview. There are specific interactions that have been, very compelling, and the pushback. I look at Calvin Coolidge and the mayor of Boston. That happened to him, and he fired the whole police department. Actually, probably what led him to become president. But it takes really extreme action historically to be able to act against that, and he did that as a conservative. So I don't know.
As a 35 year firefighter, one of the things, oh, we need more money, we need another fire station, so let's let a house burn. Let's move in slower and let the house burn instead of doing our aggressive attack like we normally do, and then saying if we had one more person on the engine or one more person here or there. So here's my question: the politics versus qualified immunity? Because you got the politics saying one thing, and you do things wrong, but you've got qualified immunity from your department, and they're kind of pushing it under the table. Can you
Mhm.
talk about the two of them, how they counteract each other?
Yeah, so I mean, I've never been fully sold on qualified immunity being a solution to the broader issues in police accountability. And I'll say that the fundamental idea is that you have officers, as long as they are working within the scope of their professional responsibilities. So if they're going out and they got to use force and they use force, they are not held personally liable. If somebody sues the city for $1 million, even if it's considered administratively misconduct, as long as it's within the scope of their duties, the city's going to foot the bill, or the city's insurer is going to foot the bill. Um, when you add that layer of so in some states, I believe Colorado, I'm blanking. It might be Minnesota, where they've got like the officer can be held liable up to 15, $20,000 to that effect. I just don't think it resolves the issue, right? I think you build resentment, right? The pocketbook is going to be the most sensitive thing for an officer, and I view for office like you're already stressed out, and you're working with this vision of a pension that's going to give you more financial freedom. I don't. I think that it creates more problems than it solves. I've seen in some places conversations about creating an insurance program where, like you're an anesthesiologist, that an officer has to get an insurance policy, and if you commit more misconduct, your premium goes up, and then ultimately it's not tenable for the city to cover you. I feel like that gives a fair um, shake to the officer, because one of the challenges too is that let's say the city, and cities settle lawsuits all the time. Let's say the city has a big $1 million lawsuit and they want to settle for $25,000. And if you as an officer feel like you didn't commit misconduct, but the city's trying to settle that and you might be personally liable for some of it, I just it creates serious sour grapes if you're going to drop 10 grand on something that where you don't feel like you committed misconduct. Where if it's just a premium and your insurer is like, hey, you can't be caught up in this. I think it's a I think it creates a more stable environment for officers to just understand, all right, these are the consequences, as opposed to like the vagaries of a civil lawsuit system. That's just my personal take. Like, I think you're going to see in different, and you've also seen that officers, when faced with that, tend to push back against it a little more severely than other accountability methods. So um, that's my pitch. I'm always interested to hear like ways in which it might be working well, but and also I think one thing that has worked quite well that parallels sort of some of the qualified immunity framework is post board. So police officer standard and training, the ability for a state level board to revoke your license to be a police officer if you commit serious misconduct. I think that is actually working pretty well. I know in Colorado, where I work some of the time, I continue to work with whether it's Senator Hickenlooper or other folks in local government there. And I was just speaking on a state bill there to bar officers from asking the question, do you know why I stopped you? Essentially eliciting a potentially incriminating answer. The bill didn't pass, but when I look at Colorado, their post board is pretty hardcore. So they'll pull an officer's license to be in law enforcement with as long as there's concrete evidence that serious misconduct was done. I think one of the challenges in California is there's a very severe backlog, and I don't know that it was funded to the extent. I don't think the state realized how many complaints of serious misconduct would be coming through.
Let me follow up on that a little bit. One of the issues that I see is that when the city does have to pay out on a civil rights lawsuit against the police department, it's not coming out of the police department budget. And
Yep.
and if the police leadership had to factor that into their own operation of their police department, would that have an effect? At least a portion of it actually affect it. So because one of the things that I've seen is when you have something, the George Floyd case is a perfect example where there was a police officer who was primarily responsible, who had a history of abuse.
Yeah,
And
and chokehold complaint.
right, right. So, to the extent, and it'd be bad enough that, okay, that officer was still allowed out on the street, but that officer was actually made a training officer. And
Mhm.
these other young officers that were involved in that incident, they were looking up to their boss. Their boss was telling them what to do in that situation, where if the police department knows that that's the kind of thing that's going to get them in trouble, the police leaders can say, okay, maybe I want to send that guy back to retraining rather than make him a trainer.
Yeah, I mean the challenge that we saw as we were putting the book together, there were some officers who we wanted to bring the spotlight on, sort of who were these folks, and we actually started to tabulate online. You could see how many career arrests they'd made, their disciplinary histories, et cetera. And there was a trend: the more arrests you had, the likelier you were to be an officer, not only who had a lot of misconduct charges, but who had moved up the ranks. And right, there's a feedback loop. If you're an officer who puts up good numbers, you make a lot of arrests, and those arrests are not necessarily vetted for the constitutionality. You don't necessarily have an investigation. Actually, in 1993, the NYPD merged with the uh, transit police department, and the transit police department, as far as I understand, used to conduct an investigation anytime the DA didn't prosecute your arrest, because they would say, well, what if you couldn't convince the DA, why'd you make that arrest? So that practice ended when they merged. And, so the quality of arrest isn't particularly important to the politician. If you come to the politician as the police chief and say, hey, we made 1,000 arrests yesterday. All right. Well, how many of them were meaningful? How many that actually reflected criminal action? How many did the DA say, all right, there's enough evidence to move forward with? That's not part of the conversation. And critically, it's not part of the promotional process, right? When you are looking at an officer's evaluation and they get their score, they get their supervisor, and it says the quantity of arrests, the quantity of summonses, the quantity of violations that they enforced, that doesn't give you a picture of the quality, the constitutionality of the work they're doing and the effectiveness with which they can train folks to be constitutional. But what it does is it's, a moneymaker for the leadership of the police department in some circumstances. So there needs to be a counterbalancing effort on that front. And I mean, even what I can say is that when we were in conversations in Oakland about discipline, because sometimes there'd be a range for discipline, and you're having a conversation about what's reasonable within that range. You give somebody 5 days, you give somebody 25 days suspension for a given act. There is a temptation in law enforcement when you have the supervisor come in, and because we'll ask, hey, can the supervisor come in, tell us who this officer is, give us your assessment of their work, et cetera. There's a temptation to say, they're high performing, they're out there. And I'm like, I would say, hey, that's not relevant to our disciplinary conversation here. And that's not right. That's the number of arrests they're doing, right? Your perspective on the quantity of output shouldn't impact whether or not this officer is disciplined more or less. But I think that that's standard practice across the U.S. And so there's a number of different ways you can check on that, but also I don't think that it's being effectively tracked right now nationwide. And I'm excited because at some point I think there's going to be a real hardcore study as opposed to our sort of speculation based on an assessment of NYPD officers to show, yeah, the more officers or the more arrests you make, the more protected you are from allegations of misconduct. And you've seen over and over again here in New York. And I actually just talked to somebody who wrote their thesis about this, where the clearest correlation between having a lot of complaints against you is a smooth promotional path moving forward. And sometimes it's viewed as a badge of honor. Combine that with high arrest numbers because those complaints are viewed as, oh, they're out in the streets. They're getting their hands dirty. Of course, they're going to have complaints against them, but it doesn't actually get down to the facts of like what happened in these individual instances and what are the consequences for the community. And going back to that, in New York, you had $200 million in lawsuits against the settled lawsuits against the NYPD in 2024. It's down to 117 million last year. It's a lot of money, and as you pointed out, not really a consequence for anyone other than the taxpayer.
And as a supervisor, you don't want to know. You don't want to know what's going on out there. You're just glad you have somebody in there out there doing the work. And so as he does the work and gets promoted and so on and so on, Riverside had an incident. Taisha Miller, a girl fell asleep in a car. The police rolled up on her in the middle of the night. I think it was 2 or 3 in the morning. Looked in the car, and there was a gun between her legs, and they ended up shooting her.
Hmm.
And after that, uh, my neighbor comes down, knocks on my door, and he says, "Hey, my son was one of those guys, and he's been terminated." And I said, "Really?" He says, "Yeah." And he talked, and here's the thing for me: like the George Floyd, he was a rookie, just following orders. When the first shot went, everybody started shooting. Is what happened. We got out of control. People get fired, and I'm just confused about looking at George Floyd, looking at those three other officers. What did you think they were going to do?
And I think that, you know, the George Floyd situation, I feel a little bit different about than what you're describing. But I would say that, right? I mean, I think there was a duty to intervene with Chauvin, but I do think, with shots fired, like for example, you see internal affairs is a very politically responsive body in any police department. If you got a ton of pressure coming on the chief to make an action, your investigations are liable to reflect not the facts, but that political pressure. And it's something that I really valued in our oversight environment, where when we saw internal pressure to make disciplinary decisions, we did that entirely apart from department politics. If there was somebody, because you might become aware, yeah, there's somebody they're trying to get out of here. We're going to follow the facts. We're going to make our judgment and we're going to be consistent with the prior discipline that's been issued. I don't really care who this is or whether somebody's protesting or whether the mayor says this, I need some response. And so, and it wasn't just because out of the goodness of our heart, it's like we didn't have that pressure on us. And so, right, if you've got an instance where there's four people shot in our investigation, first of all, you're going to be assessing who fired the first shot. You're going to be interviewing those officers and assessing how much time there was between the first shot. Because, yeah, as you pointed out, the first person who shoots is setting off fireworks, right? And so you're going to be bringing in an expert and talking about, okay, the time between the shots, does that reflect an independent decision to shoot, or does that reflect a responsiveness to the first shot? You're going to be interviewing the officer probably again after you talk to that expert, making sure you got clarity on that front. And then assessing from there, I think that the challenge, even in the instance you're describing, is that's not going to be a public record per se. Like I'd be interested to find, or if it is in California in particular, it's probably going to be 4 or 5 years till that gets out, right? My understanding of SB 1421, and right, we had records on shootings that were supposed to be made public, but I don't believe that more than two or three of the investigations that I worked on beginning in early 2023 have reached the public record, even though this was supposed to be some vaunted Transparency Act. So even any questions that you raise, like it's absurd that you don't have a report to look on and be like, all right, was this grounded in fact? When you get and I think that New York's done a pretty good job of that in publicizing the records. There's an online lookup you can do. And California is way behind on that because I always wanted, we'd have conversations with the community and I'd be like, yeah, we're doing the investigation, know that we take it seriously. And if accountability needs to happen, we'll make sure that it happens. But at the same time, they had to rely on our word. And with a tacit understanding that like as director, I probably wouldn't be around. And I was the second longest tenured director in the history of that agency. It tells you how quick the turnover goes. But it's not a fair system because in California in particular, it's just not transparent.
We've sort of skirted this issue a couple of times in this discussion, but you talked about the multiple factions within a law enforcement agency, and you said, and not just the racism part,
Mhm.
but the racism part is persistent in even in police departments that, here in California, Antioch Police Department had a huge
Yeah,
scandal with racist tech.
I know it well. Yeah.
Torrance, California had a huge scandal involving dozens of officers, right? This isn't a small, few bad apples. This is a significant issue that police departments don't seem to even want to acknowledge is a problem, much less address in a way that would suppress that kind of activity. Can you talk about how that issue is why it's so persistent?
Why is that so persistent?
We'll need another hour for that, I'm sure. But
Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you, it was interesting. I was pretty struck when I first came to Oakland because I grew up there. I understood the police department's reputation. And so when I first got there, I went to the investigators on our team and I was like, so, what do the cases look like here? Give me a flavor, right? Everywhere's got it different for what's going to be like the highlight of an investigator's docket and what's the average case. In New York, it's search warrants left and right. There's a lot of bad entries, in my personal opinion, a lot of bad stop and frisks, and a ton of complaints on that front. Um, and I was like, all right, so who's handling like the racial stuff? And they're like, what do you mean? And I was like, so what do you do when an officer, uses the N-word? And they're like, it's been years since we had that. And I was like, what? Are you serious? Because I came from the NYPD universe where that's just standard fare, sure felt like that. But at the same time, you know, it's about that's a broader political issue, the way I view it. It's like, all right, so in Oakland, for example, you really had the Great Migration era where you suddenly have a city that used to be pretty white becomes very black and a police department that's still very white. And that's your Black Panther era. The folks who were running the police department or in the police department at that time are still like in and around Oakland. And if you're in a police department, you're still aware of the retired folks who are around. Maybe you hang out with them. And that culture, like, it's sort of like the law. There's this huge delay where, I mean, I was aware of like, there are generations of officers who I'm not going to interact with at all, but I know that people in this department are talking to perhaps daily. And they've got ye old views on race. Um, so that's built into a certain extent. I think that and it's like even in Oakland, people would talk about like the Klan in Oakland. People be like, "Oh, there's a Klan HQ over the next city over," right? And you just whether or not that was true, it was part of the lore. And then you see, it becomes a lot more red and a lot more willingness to be overtly racist out there. And I think I don't know, departments still manage to protect that in a way that I think internal affairs bears a significant responsibility for. And I mean, from department to department, you are deciding whether to take these issues seriously, culturally, socially. We understand that these issues exist. And one strange example or bleak example is in Chicago. They found pretty recently, last couple of years, that a bunch of officers had signed up for like a Klan event or a Klan to join the Klan. It was like, and then the department refused to even investigate it because they said that there wasn't proof that they had actually joined, right? So that's one of the challenges. Like, there's no outside of the common sense. Because when I talk to folks who don't know that much about this, they're like, "What? There isn't independent oversight of police departments around the country? That's crazy." Um, and at the same time, so you have a common sense of like, well, you would want to suss out racism in a police department, or you would want to suss out people who are involved in like organized radical racist groups. But where is the political pressure for that, right? Does the mayor of Chicago have an interest in opening that can of worms? Does the mayor of any city have that interest? And that's why I think independent oversight that has serious protections is so important because you're just thinking about the community interest, right? And when I'm sitting down talking to the department, I can just say straightforwardly, like, hey, here are the rules, right? It says you can't join a hate group. I'm here to, it says by law, I got to investigate these complaints. It's nothing personal. But if a mayor in any city was like, we're going at this, it's personal. And because and there's no framework for these things to organically be addressed except for in very specific issues where you've got an officer's text a group text chain blows up and everybody it gets publicized. So I don't know, I mean, these issues have been around for a long time, but I'd like to think that if we had institutional changes that were designed for these issues to be to arise and then be resolved, we'd have a much different system.
Thank you. We don't want to hold you too long, so thank you for joining us today, and can't wait to see the book. Get the book and read it. Hopefully, you'll come back again because this is very interesting stuff, and you got a lot of good information. So, thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks. Thank you, Mac.
Thank you.
Here's the book, everybody. Go get it. And Mike and Stan, you've got yours coming in the mail.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mac.
Have a great one.
Thank you.
Conversations on Race and Policing has been supported by funding from the California State University San Bernardino College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Faux Library, and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Finn Lee is our technical consultant. Pamela Crossan provides administrative support, and Alan Yavor provides communication support. There's more information in the show notes, and please join us online at csusb.edu/CORP for upcoming programming and to find our catalog of over 100 past events with guests like Robin D.G. Kelly, Jamal Bowman, Dorothy Roberts, and many more.